Meet Sidney Nolan, written by Yvonne Mes. As a boy, Sidney Nolan would listen to his grandfather's tales of his days as a police officer in the Victorian countryside. Sidney's favourite stories were of the famous bushranger Ned Kelly. Sidney imagined the policemen calling out as they circled the Kelly gang's hiding place. He pictured Ned Kelly striding away from the burning Glenrowan Hotel. He saw the thick black armour made from ploughs. He had touched that armour once while on a school trip and felt those fierce eyes flash at him from behind the mask. When he was a young man, Sidney got a job at the art department of a hat factory. The work was dull and uninspiring, so one day he enrolled in evening classes at the National Gallery School. But Sidney's favourite place to go was the reading room in the nearby public library. There he read mountains of books, drank rivers of poetry, and soaked up the philosophers. He longed to make art like Picasso, Matisse, and other modernist artists from Europe. The modernists believed that art should express ideas through symbols, colours, and shapes. They were of the opinion that the world changed. Art needed to change as well, and Sidney felt the same. Australia seemed so far away from the art and culture of Europe. With no money to travel there, Sidney stowed away on a ship to London, but was caught and sent back. As a desperate last attempt, Sidney visited the lawyer John Reed. He had heard of John's love for modern art and boldly asked him for money to buy a ticket to London. John Reed was not willing to pay for Sidney's voyage to Europe, but he admired the young artist's courage and was impressed by his work. He invited Sidney to a dinner that would change everything. John and Sunday Reed's home, named Hyde, turned out to be a haven for artists just like Sidney. Painters, poets, writers, and musicians would gather to discuss ideas and share their dreams. They made music or wrote poetry, and Sidney painted. At last, Sidney had found the place he had longed for. On the other side of the world, World War II had begun. In 1942, Sidney was conscripted into the Australian Army and stationed around the small towns of the Wimmera, guarding food supplies. Still, he found time to paint. How he loved the landscape and the light. When Sidney lost the tops of 2 of his fingers in an accident, he met soldiers in hospital who had served on the front lines. After listening to their stories of fighting, injury, and death, Sidney decided he would not be sent overseas to fight in a war. However, Corporal Nolan soon got the call. Sidney ran. He hid away, moving between a friend's studio and Hyde. His parents were ashamed, and his friends were uncomfortable. Still, Sidney painted on. His thoughts turned to the stories he had grown up with, of another outlaw like him, a rebel on the run. He used vivid colours to suggest light and heat. The Australian dirt, scrub, and trees appeared as they had never appeared before. The paintings were sometimes moody, the landscape sparse and stark. In the foreground, Sidney forged a figure like no other, a black square with a slit for eyes, sometimes empty like the armour he had touched so many years ago. Sidney poured his feelings about war and violence into the hardboard. He poured the adventures of his youth. He poured his modernist ideas. And he poured his secrets that would forever remain hidden behind Ned Kelly's mask. The time had come for Sidney to leave Hyde and set out on his own. He bestowed the Ned Kelly paintings to the Reeds. When they first showed his work in Melbourne, the paintings were ignored or mocked. When the paintings were exhibited in France, however, they were declared the most important art to come out of Australia and the work of a true poet and painter. Finally, Australia began to embrace Sidney Nolan and his paintings. Sidney developed a new and exciting way to paint his country's landscape. His art helped Australia to build a new identity after the struggles of 2 world wars. He travelled all over the world and painted many magnificent stories, but his best loved works were those brought to life from the tales he first heard as a boy. On this page we have a timeline from Sidney Nolan's life, depicting the highlights from his life and the years that he painted his most famous paintings.